In the 16th century, justice was not written with quills and ink. It was carved into flesh, etched into bone, and displayed upon the public square for all to see. This was an age when mercy was considered weakness, when authority was measured not by compassion, but by the spectacle of suffering it could command. To be condemned in such a time was not simply to be put to death. It was to be broken deliberately, humiliated beyond recognition, and erased under the gaze of neighbors, strangers, and the ever-watchful eyes of the church. The villages of Germany bore witness to this truth daily. Fields lay scarred by famine, families bent beneath the crushing weight of taxation, and over it all loomed the gallows and the scaffold. These structures of timber were not hidden in shadows, nor concealed behind fortress walls. They stood proudly in the heart of every market square, rising like grim monuments to the power of lords and bishops. They were sermons without words, lessons written in rope and fire. Look closer, and the images sharpen. A prisoner is dragged before the people. The noose is tightened around his neck, his body lifted, choking, twitching. The crowd holds its breath as the condemned dangles between life and death, neither released to the grave nor spared for the future. And then suddenly he is cut down, gasping, his chest heaving, air clawed into ruined lungs. This is not mercy, it is method. A man half dead is easier to bend than a man whole. Elsewhere, the smell of scorched flesh fills the square. Iron brands, heated until they glow red, are pressed against bare skin. The hiss, the scream, the stench. These are the notes of a grim music, a hymn to obedience. The victims writhe, flesh seared open, while the officials declare the punishment just, holy, ordained. Children cling to their mothers' skirts, forced to watch, for even the young must learn that defiance has a price. And then the wheel, the most feared of all instruments. Iron-bound spokes await the prisoner's limbs. Each strike of the executioner's hammer snaps bone against wood, turning flesh into ruin. The body is bent and twisted until it resembles not a man, but a broken thing displayed for crows. The crowd watches in silence, horror mingled with something darker, resignation. They know this cruelty is not aberration, it is order. It is the very rhythm of the world they inhabit. The silence of the people is telling. They do not cheer, nor do they riot. Their stillness is obedience, heavier than any sermon uttered from the pulpit. Fear governs more surely than faith. Each cry of pain, each groan of torment becomes another stone in the fortress of authority. And yet, in the margins of this tableau, a figure emerges, not with the grandeur of lords, nor the sanctity of priests, but with the raw presence of a man shaped by earth and toil. His hands are hardened by the plow, his skin darkened by sun and labor. His eyes burn with something rare in such an age, fire. Jakob Rohrbach stands in the shadows, a son of the soil, forged not by privilege, but by suffering. He has seen the gallows rise in the village square. He has heard the crack of whips, the hiss of iron, the rattle of chains. He has witnessed neighbors reduced to silence by terror, their backs bent not only from toil, but from the weight of obedience. And within him grows a conviction that no man was born to crawl, that the soil beneath their feet belongs not only to princes and bishops, but to those who bleed upon it. This is the world that formed him, a theater of cruelty, a stage where suffering was law and submission, the only script permitted. But out of that cruelty would rise defiance. Out of the silence, a voice. Out of the shadow, a man who dared to step into the light. For in the 16th century, justice may have been written in blood, but blood has a way of feeding the earth, and from that soil, rebellion begins to grow. The 16th century was not only an age of cruelty, it was an age of fire. From village to village, the embers of discontent glowed, smoldering in the silence of peasants bent beneath the lash of lords and bishops. Hunger gnawed at their children, while taxes stripped their harvest bare. Fields that should have yielded bread became prisons of toil, and the people who worked them knew themselves not as men and women, but as shadows beneath another's power. Yet in silence, rebellion was growing. It began like the crack of kindling. One estate, once proud and fortified, was set ablaze. Flames licked at its stone walls, rising into the dawn sky, carrying with them centuries of resentment. And from that blaze a chorus rose, not of mourning, but of triumph. The peasants sang, voices ragged yet unbroken, hymns not of the church but of defiance, words carried on the wind like prayers no priest would bless. Across the land, farmers put aside their plows and seized what weapons they could. Scythes sharpened into blades, clubs cut from oak, hammers that once built barns now raised against tyranny. They were not soldiers, yet they marched as though an army summoned from the earth itself. Behind every face burned the same conviction. The world could not remain as it was. The lords had taken too much, the bishops had preached too long, and the weight of obedience had grown heavier than chains. And then, Jakob Rohrbach. He did not descend from the halls of nobility, he rose from the fields as one of them. He stood atop a wagon, the rough wood creaking beneath his boots, his voice carrying across the crowd not with polish but with fire. His words struck not like scripture, but like lightning. The yoke of lords and bishops must be broken, he declared, and in that moment he became more than a man. He became the vessel of their fury, the mouthpiece of their hunger, the breath of their defiance. The peasants answered him not with silence, but with thunder. Their cheer rolled across the fields, echoing against hills and valleys, as if the earth itself approved. For the first time they did not feel alone. For the first time they believed their suffering could give birth to change. Behind Rohrbach's voice, their grievances found shape, and in his fire, they glimpsed hope. But where peasants found courage, nobles found fear. Behind closed doors in stone halls guarded by steel, whispers grew sharp as knives. They spoke of rebellion, not as folly, but as contagion, something that must be crushed before it spread. To the ears of the church, Rohrbach was not merely a troublemaker. He was a heretic, a blasphemer who dared to set the poor against God's anointed rulers. And for that crime, there could be no forgiveness. The air thickened with tension. For every castle that fell, armies were raised. For every hymn of freedom, a sermon of damnation was preached. And at the center stood Rohrbach, knowing well the weight of his path. He had seen the instruments of cruelty. He knew the price of defiance was not only death, but torment, a death meant to erase not just the man, but the memory of him. Yet he did not falter. To turn back was to betray not only himself, but the thousands who now looked to him as leader, as brother, as symbol. So the uprising marched onward, lit by the glow of burning estates, carried forward by the thunder of peasant songs. The earth trembled beneath their steps, not because they were mighty, but because they were many, and because their hearts beat as one. This was not merely a revolt. It was a reckoning. A cry long stifled, now unleashed. The peasants' uprising was more than the breaking of chains. It was the breaking of silence. And at its heart stood Jakob Rohrbach, the farmer turned firebrand, the man who dared to speak aloud what generations had only whispered. His words would brand him a traitor, a heretic, a rebel. Yet to the poor he was something else entirely. He was the promise that their suffering had meaning, that their blood could water the seeds of freedom. The uprising had begun, and there would be no turning back. Night fell heavy upon the land. The fires that once marked defiance now smoldered into ashes, their glow swallowed by the cold of defeat. The rebellion, which had risen like a storm, faltered under the steel of princes and the wrath of bishops. Blood marked the fields, villages lay broken, and the songs of freedom faded into silence. Where once there had been hope, now there was only the echo of screams and the smell of smoke. And in that darkness, betrayal found its moment. Jakob Rohrbach, the voice of the peasants, the man who had stood on wagons and called for the breaking of the yoke, was delivered into the hands of his enemies. Not captured in battle, not cut down with honor, but betrayed, sold by whispers, traded for safety, perhaps even for gold. Chains clamped around his wrists, iron biting deeper than any blade, and he was dragged like a criminal into the courtyard of a fortress where judgment would not wait. To rise against a lord was treason, to rise against the church was damnation. Rohrbach had done both. His fate was not in question, only the manner of his unmaking remained. And so the torturers began their work, methodical as priests at the altar. deliberate as scribes copying holy texts. Their task was not to kill, but to strip away the layers of resistance, to turn defiance into confession, and confession into submission. The first blows came with the whips. Leather cracked through the night air, striking flesh with a sound sharper than thunder. Each lash tore skin, leaving lines of fire across his back, blood rising to the surface like ink upon parchment. His body jerked, but no words escaped him, only breath drawn, ragged through clenched teeth. The pain was meant to unmake him, but it only revealed his silence. Then came the clamps, iron jaws fastening upon limbs, crushing bone and muscle, with a pressure that mocked the strength of the plowman he once was. Questions rained upon him as mercilessly as the blows. Who else plotted with you? Who gave you courage to rise? Whose names do you conceal? Each demand was sharpened by cruelty, yet each answer was nothing. He gave them no betrayal, no name, no surrender, only silence, punctuated by the rhythm of pain. The courtyard stones grew slick with his blood, yet still he stood, or was lifted to his knees again when his body collapsed. His suffering was deliberate, measured. This was not the swift justice of an axe, nor the sudden mercy of a blade. This was theater, a slow dissection of flesh and will, a torment designed not only to punish Rohrbach, but to warn every ear that might still whisper rebellion. But the silence endured. In the face of agony, he spoke not of allies, nor of regrets. His silence was louder than confession, heavier than accusation. It was the silence of defiance, a refusal that no chain, no whip, no iron could break. The torturers worked until exhaustion dulled even their cruelty. Yet Rohrbach remained unbroken. His body was broken, yes, scourged, blood-soaked, mangled by iron, but the man within endured. For in every ragged breath, he held fast to the knowledge that his suffering was no longer his alone. It was shared, carried by the peasants who still remembered his words, by the fields that had heard their songs, by the soil that had drunk their blood. In that courtyard, beneath the shadow of fortress walls, Jakob Rohrbach ceased to be merely a man. He became an echo, a symbol, a martyr in the making. The lords and bishops believed they were crushing rebellion, but in truth, with every lash and every question unanswered, they were engraving his defiance deeper into memory. And so the night dragged on, heavy with torment, heavier still with silence. A silence not of submission, but of endurance. The hour of judgment arrived, and with it, the full weight of power cloaked itself in ritual. From the high steps of the fortress, a bishop emerged, robed in crimson, his voice ringing cold against the stone walls of the square. In his hands lay no sword, no whip, no instrument of pain, but his words carried a sharper edge than any blade. He spoke the sentence, each syllable falling heavy as an iron chain. Jakob Rohrbach was to be quartered by horses. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden wind. Even in an age accustomed to cruelty, this punishment was whispered with dread. It was not the justice of hanging, nor the spectacle of the wheel. Quartering was reserved for the gravest traitors, those who had dared to defy not only their lord, but the order of the world itself. To be condemned in such a way was not merely to die, but to be unmade, torn into fragments so that nothing of the man might remain whole. The square began to swell with people. Peasants pressed shoulder to shoulder, drawn by fear as much as by fascination. Mothers clutched their children close, shielding young eyes that could not be spared the sight. Priests stood at the edges, murmuring prayers, though whether for the salvation of Rohrbach's soul or the preservation of authority, none could say. Soldiers lined the square, their armor gleaming, their blades sharpened, a wall of steel to remind the people where power lay. And then, the sound of hooves. 4 black horses were led forward, restless, stamping against the cobblestones. Their nostrils steamed in the cold air, their bodies straining against reins as if they sensed the role they were about to play. They were no longer beasts of the field, but instruments of a sentence, transformed into living engines of terror. Every eye in the square fixed upon them, for it was through their strength that justice would be carried out. The execution ground was prepared with deliberate care, as though for a performance. Ropes coiled like serpents upon the ground. The space was cleared, not for combat, but for spectacle. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, heavy with anticipation, charged with the knowledge that what was about to unfold would not be easily forgotten. At last, Jakob Rohrbach was brought forth. His body bore the marks of torment, scourged, bloodied, bruised by the hands of torturers. But his spirit stood unbroken. Chains rattled with each step, yet his gaze remained steady, unwavering. He did not look upon the bishop who had pronounced his fate, nor upon the soldiers who enforced it. His eyes sought the crowd sweeping across the sea of faces, not with pleading, but with defiance. It was as if he meant to remind them all, lords, priests, peasants alike, that though his body was bound, his will remained his own. In that silent glance, he declared a truth that no judgment could erase, that fear had not conquered him, that obedience had not claimed his soul. The murmurs of the people hushed into silence. The sentence had been spoken, the stage set, the actors assembled. Justice in this age was theater, and Rohrbach had been cast not as man, but as warning. Yet even bound, even condemned, he refused the role of victim. He stood instead as witness, witness to the cruelty of the powerful, witness to the courage of defiance, witness to the truth that even in defeat, dignity could not be destroyed. Thus the square held its breath, waiting for the final act. The judgment had been spoken. Now it was time for the world to see it carried out. The square grew still, the silence of hundreds pressing down heavier than stone. Every breath hung suspended as the ropes were brought forth. Coarse hemp fibers meant not to bind, but to destroy. One was fastened to each arm, another to each leg, every knot pulled tight until flesh darkened beneath the strain. 4 lines stretched outward like the spokes of a wheel, and at the end of each, the restless power of a horse waited. The animals stamped, muscles rippling beneath dark hides, their breath steaming in the morning chill. Their eyes rolled white, nostrils flaring, as if even they sensed the horror into which they had been conscripted. The handlers gripped their reins with nervous hands, awaiting the signal, knowing that once given, there could be no undoing. Then came the command. A whip cracked, sharp as lightning, and the horses lunged. The square erupted with a sound beyond imagining. Chains snapped taut. Rohrbach's body was torn in opposite directions, jerked so violently that the air itself seemed to shatter. His cry rose, raw and primal, not merely a sound of pain, but a tearing of the very human spirit. Flesh stretched, bones gave way, the rending echo silencing even the loudest murmur. In that moment, pain ceased to be personal. It became performance. It was no longer the torment of a single man. It was a spectacle for all, a lesson written in agony. The lords intended it as warning. This is the price of rebellion. This is the fate of defiance. And yet, within that theater of cruelty, another truth emerged. For even as his body was torn, Rohrbach's defiance endured. His scream carried not only suffering, but resistance, an unbroken spirit refusing to be erased. The crowd recoiled. Mothers clutched their children closer, turning away their faces, desperate to shield young eyes from the vision of a man undone. Others could not look away, transfixed by the raw force of the spectacle, caught between horror and fascination. The square became a mirror, reflecting not only the cruelty of the rulers, but the frailty of all who lived beneath them. Priests raised their hands to the sky, voices intoning that justice had been fulfilled, that the rebellion had been purged in blood and sinew. Their words echoed against the walls, but even as they spoke, the people heard another sermon, the silent one written in Rohrbach's suffering, in his refusal to bow. The church proclaimed obedience, but the square whispered of courage. Each moment dragged like eternity. The horses strained, whips cracked again, the body convulsed, and with every tearing sound the square seemed to shrink beneath the weight of violence. The spectacle was intended to end rebellion, yet in its very savagery it carved defiance deeper into the hearts of those who watched. For they saw not only what had been done to a man, but what power feared, the courage of the poor, the fire of a farmer who had dared to speak. When at last silence fell, it was not peace. It was the silence of shock, of memory being etched indelibly upon the minds of all present. The deed was done, yet its echo had only begun. Jakob Rohrbach's body lay ruined, but his defiance endured. For in that square, beneath the weight of cruelty, pain became more than pain. It became spectacle. It became warning. And in the shadows of memory, it became something greater still. It became the seed of legend. Silence. The kind of silence that follows not peace, but exhaustion. The square, once alive with shouts and cries, now lies drowned in stillness. The stones are stained a deep red, the earth drinking what it has been fed. The horses stand panting, flanks trembling, steam rising from their bodies like smoke from a battlefield. The deed is done. Jakob Rohrbach is no more, or so the rulers believe. Soldiers move with grim efficiency, carrying away what remains. Each fragment of him is destined for display. Nailed upon gates, hung upon walls, scattered across the land like grotesque warnings. To the lords and bishops, this is proclamation. It is power written not in parchment, but in flesh, meant to remind all who see, rebellion is feudal, defiance is death. Memory itself can be butchered and scattered. Yet memory is never so obedient. For even as the soldiers march, whispers begin. Around hearths where families huddle against the night, his name is spoken softly, carefully, as though the very act of remembering is an act of treason. Mothers whisper to their children of the man who stood upon a wagon and dared to speak. Old men murmur over their ale of the farmer who would not bend. And in the flicker of candlelight, prayers rise, not to saints carved in stone, but to the courage of a peasant who defied both Lord and church. He was meant to vanish, torn to fragments, yet memory does not obey. Jakob Rohrbach became not merely a man, but a shadow, one that stretched beyond the gallows, beyond the square, beyond even the reach of the church's cross. He became a seed, buried in soil made fertile by blood and sorrow, waiting for a season yet to come. The rulers believed they had ended him. What they had ended was his body, nothing more. For every drop of blood spilled, another voice took shape. For every lash endured, another heart grew restless. The spectacle intended to erase him only engraved him deeper into the fabric of memory. The camera rises above the smoking fields of Germany. Villages lie scarred, castles still burn, and yet beneath the ruins, something stirs. The cross of the church towers high, casting its shadow across the land, declaring order, obedience, dominion. But shadows cannot silence echoes, and beneath that shadow the whispers of rebellion linger still. They travel with the wind across valleys and hills, carried in songs too quiet to be hymns, in stories too dangerous to be written, in the fire that smolders in every oppressed heart. This was the legacy of Jakob Rohrbach, not a monument in stone, not a triumph recorded in chronicles, but a defiance that could not be quartered. The rulers sought to scatter him, yet in scattering they sowed him. And what is sown will one day return, greater, fiercer, uncontainable. For the 16th century was an age of cruelty, but cruelty cannot rule forever. Blood can silence a voice, but it cannot silence a truth. Jakob Rohrbach's truth was simple, dangerous, eternal. That the soil belongs not to those who exploit it, but to those who labor upon it. And so his name endured, whispered where silence was demanded, remembered where forgetting was commanded. His death was meant to end rebellion, but instead it became its beginning.